Acting Chief Justice David Angel, and your fellow judges, Justice John Reeves of the Federal Court, Chief Magistrate Jenny Blockland and your fellow magistrates, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Northern Territory Bar Association and the Law Society Northern Territory and its President Duncan McConnell, I bid you a warm welcome to our address today, to be presented by Justice Michael Kirby. We welcome Justice Kirby on what is his last visit to Darwin as a High Court judge, and to listen to his address to the profession on an insider's view of the High Court. I should make a special thanks at this stage to the judges and the sheriff's officers for helping to set up the court today and making it available. I was told before Christmas that we would probably get about 20, maybe 30 people max today. It was the wrong time of year, it was too hot. It's very hard to get the profession mobilised at this time of year. But I think the cynics and sceptics may have underestimated the pulling power of our distinguished guest today, and the fact that he seems to be able to attract a big mob wherever he goes. Justice Kirby needs little introduction for those of us who are lawyers, but I feel obliged to make a brief mention for those who don't know these matters or perhaps need a reminder. Justice Kirby started his career in law as a solicitor, then as a barrister. He was then appointed as a Deputy President of the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission back in 1974. I'm told that he was the youngest man appointed to federal judicial office in Australia, and by the time he arrived at the High Court in 1996, he'd already served in the judicial hierarchy on the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission for some 9 years. He moonlighted for 8 of those 9 years as the inaugural chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission. He sat as a Justice of the Federal Court of Australia for about a year in 1984. He then became the President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, where his appointment lasted some 12 years, and concurrently, for the last couple of years of that appointment, he served as President of the Court of Appeal of the Solomon Islands. That must have been hard, Judge. He then arrived at the High Court, as I mentioned, in 1996, and he's served 12 years, is due to retire on the 2nd of February in just over 2 weeks. If you want to know about Justice Kirby's career and life, I really won't read it and narrate it today. It's narrated in numerous biographical entries, such as in Who's Who Australia, the High Court site, and on the internet generally. I did a Google search for Justice Michael Kirby early this afternoon, and the first page brought up, quote, about 198,000 entries. So 1 to 10 on the first page of 198,000. And it occurred to me that that's probably more than the combined total of everybody's entries in this crowded room. Those hundreds and thousands of references relate to Justice Kirby's career in the judiciary, his involvement with universities and other tertiary educational institutions, both here and overseas, his active professional involvement in law reform, privacy, bioethics and human rights, his international work in relation to HIV, AIDS and human rights, along with the honours bestowed on him by the Australian nation and honorary degrees by many of our Australian universities, and I haven't even delved into the international honours and prizes which his honour has been awarded. Justice Kirby has had a long connection with the legal profession in the Northern Territory, not only as a Justice of the High Court, hearing many appeals and applications for special leave to appeal. This jurisdiction seems to throw up more than its fair share of High Court cases. Some would say it's a disproportionate number for the size of our jurisdiction. Justice Kirby's attended and participated as a speaker in several of the now legendary Bali Clant Criminal Lawyers Association of the Northern Territory conferences, and he's been actively involved with that organisation. As recently as 2007, Justice Kirby came to Darwin at that time to relaunch the Northern Territory Law Journal. Those who were there will remember that he spoke that day with great insight as to the practical relevance of law journals and the extent to which they can significantly influence judicial decision-making, and indeed even at the highest level. Judge, you and Johan have become good friends with many of the characters who comprise our practicing profession and judiciary, and you've taken Darwin very much to heart. We know that your life at the present time is very frantic. It's been lived by you at a crushing pace, certainly for the last 12 years of service, and as it winds down to its very last fortnight, we feel very privileged that you've come to Darwin today to deliver your address to the members of the Northern Territory legal profession. You should know that here you are held in great affection and respect by us, and you'll always be welcome here.
Your Honour, the Administrator, my judicial colleagues, ladies and gentlemen of the law, my much esteemed colleague Ian Barker, Mrs. Barker, ladies and gentlemen, it's very good for Jan and me to be back here in Darwin. I would invite the people who are standing at the back to, if those important people haven't turned up now, then their seats are allowed. And there are some seats here, and if necessary, we'll put you up on the bench, elevate you in a way that perhaps you never dreamed of, at least today. Let's start by, in the way the New Zealanders do, by truly remembering the original people of our country, by thinking of their place in our land and of the special role that we lawyers play in respecting them, their traditions, and ensuring that they have a true place in the heart of the law and in the protection of the law in Australia. The New Zealanders do that not in a formal and peremptory way, but in a heartfelt way, and we in Australia are learning to do the same. I'm a very old timer, as has been suggested. I've been around for a very long period, and in fact I was looking at the frontispiece of the new the Northern Territory law reports to see who were the judges at various stages in my career. In 1975, I was actually sworn in December 74 as a Deputy President of the Arbitration Commission, and Tom Hughes, who spoke on that occasion as President of the Bar of New South Wales, is going to be there at my farewell in the number 1 court in Canberra on the 2nd of February, and he's going to speak at my exit. So Tom, who is still in harness and still appears before the full court of the High Court, is going to see me in and see me out. The judges of the High Court at that time were Chief Justice Bowick, Sir Edward McTiernan, Sir Harry Gibbs, Sir Lillian Stephen, Sir Anthony Mason, Sir Kenneth Jacobs, and Justice Lionel Murphy. They were the justices of the High Court. And the justices of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory were that wonderful judge, William Foster, Jim Muirhead, a very fine man whom I got to know at that time because he was the chair of the Australian Institute of Criminology, and Dick Ward. Justice Dunphy, Justice Josky, Justice Smithers, a marvellous judge, Justice Smithers. He taught me what to do if people came into the court in the Arbitration Commission with banners and signs. He said, don't worry too much about contempt. just tell them to lift their signs because you can't see them. Lift their signs, make sure you can see them, read them, and then say, very well, I've read them, put them down. He said, it always works, they always put them down. Wonderful judge. Sir Edward Woodward, Justice Bob Frankie, Justice Jack Sweeney, a really clever industrial law judge, and Justice St John. So they were the judges, the resident and non-resident judges of the Supreme Court. In 1984, when I was appointed a full-time appellate judge in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, Chief Justice Forster had become Sir William, the first knight in the territory, and a very fine judge. The Ananda rules, I think, were the product of Chief Justice Forster's wisdom, compassion and understanding of realities. Justice Muirhead, Justice Toohey, who I later sat with in the High Court, Justice Gallop, Justice Nader, Sir William Carney, Justice Kevin O'Leary, past President of the Law Council of Australia. Really fine, wonderful judges of the territory. In 96, when I went to the High Court, Justice Brian Frank Martin was the Chief Justice. Justice Carney, Justice Angel, who does me the honour of being here tonight as acting Chief Justice, Justice Mildred, Justice Sally Thomas, non-resident judges at that time, Justice Gallop and Justice Priestley, with whom I sat in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales. Justice Priestley, a very fine judge and colleague. So they were the judges who've accompanied me on this journey. And what began on that Friday in December 1974 is soon to come to a close in Canberra. And I have to say to you, it's all a little bit surreal. If you have been living a life with a very high degree of order and a very high degree of precision and discipline, and somehow it is suddenly going to stop, then it does make you concentrate on the important things in life and what you've achieved and what you've failed in. And I've had a lot of time in recent weeks to think about that, and I'm going to say something about that at this occasion. Now, the reason you've all come in large numbers is you all hope there are going to be inside insights into the High Court of Australia, and all sorts of indelicacies and improprieties are going to be revealed, the inner tricks of the trade. You've all come here where you're not going to get it. Or at least you're only going to get little bits. And you'll have to read between the lines, because that is the tradition of the law. I was looking at a very interesting article that I wrote in the... Well, you can laugh, but you can real life in these past 34 years. I've been writing law review articles of judgments and reasons, and I was reading this excellent article, 19 Sydney Law Review, on what is it really like to be a Justice of the High Court of Australia. And in fact, it was a recording of a conversation I had with law students in Sydney Law School. The conversation was 1 year after I'd been sworn in the High Court, and I tried to explain what my daily life was like so that they would have an idea of what goes on inside the building in Canberra and elsewhere. And I read it again in preparation for these remarks, and really nothing much has changed. Nothing much does change in the great institutions of the law, and if you really want to know what is it like to be a Justice of the High Court, 19 Sydney Law Review 514. However, looking through, some little things have changed, so I'll just remind you, those of you who have been prudent enough to read that essay, what it says about an insider's view of the High Court. The first point was arrival. I remember the morning that I was told, where will you be at 6 o'clock tonight? I was in the Court of Appeal in Sydney, and I knew that at 6 o'clock that night I would be chairing a Consumers Committee at the Court of Appeal. And I received a phone call from the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet asking where I would be, and I said, well, as you know, I'm a very, very attentive person, very concerned about consumers of the Court of Appeal. We don't want to know that, we just want to know where you'll be. And I said, well, I'll be in the judges' conference room at 6 o'clock with this committee. And so at about 6:05 that night, my associate came to the door. Very unusual for an associate to interrupt a meeting in the judges' conference room. And anyway, he was admitted, and a little post-it sticker came along the successive people as it was being handed up to me. My brother Donald, who is a solicitor partner in a Sydney firm, was sitting opposite and saw the post-it sticker coming towards me, and he said, I saw the blood drain from your face as it came closer, and it was then handed to me, ring Mr. La Vache. My associate, though an honours graduate from the University of Melbourne, didn't realise that the Attorney General of the Commons was Mr. La Vache, and I was being told to ring him, which I did. I have the honour to invite you to accept the appointment. I have the honour to accept the appointment, and I will do my best. Soon after that, my partner Jan drove us down to Canberra, and we got to the High Court, and I really didn't know exactly how you got in there, because it all had gone up since my time at the bar. The Queen had opened it in 1980, and I'd been appointed, as I've said, in 1974. But we got there, and I couldn't get the door open into my room. I certainly couldn't open the door onto the balcony, which every justice has a balcony. Mine was facing Parliament House, and I have what I think is the nicest room with the brindabellas and the old Parliament House, the new Parliament House, and a vision of the whole of Canberra before me, a wonderful room. And I saw on the desk a dictaphone and some tapes. And so I reached for one of the tapes, put it on the machine, listened to the tape, and I could recognise a voice, but I didn't quite know who it was. And so I listened and listened, and I then realised that this was the dictation of the judgment in a case called Onus and Alcoa, a case about the law of standing, the right to sue in court. And I then got that out, and I realised this was the case, the voice of the long-dead Sir Keith Aiken dictating his reasons in our Onus and Alcoa. This brought home to me a very important lesson, and I expressed this in that article in 1997, that all of us who serve in judicial office, indeed all of us who serve in the law, all of us who are human, are just temporary. We are moving in and out of our responsibilities. We will not be there for long. We have an opportunity and an obligation to make the best out of life, to do the best we can, and that was my opportunity then, and in due course I said it will be the opportunity of my successor. And now my successor is about to move into my room, Justice Virginia Bell. So Justice Aiken was there. He occupied the room when the building was opened. He was succeeded by Justice Dean, and it was Justice Dean's appointment as Governor-General that made the vacancy that led to my appointment to the High Court. And I've often felt, as I've sat in that room, surrounded by books which had been marked by Justice Dean and had his stamp in it, there were often, I felt, if I can use this expression, I felt the vibes. The vibes came to me. And the vibes were the vibes of Justice Dean. Because of all of the judges at the High Court, if I ever read reasons, you know how you read the way other people express things. Some things are quite different from the way you would approach a problem or the way you would express a problem, even if you come to the same conclusion. But Justice Dean's reasoning always seems to me, I feel very comfortable. My brain somehow connects with that, and he was in that room for a very long time. After he left, I offered to send him the priceless, peerless prose that his successor had penned in his room, and he said, "Thank you, but no thank you. I do not want to continue reading the decisions of the High Court of Australia." Well, I'm telling you, I'm going to continue reading the decisions of the High Court of Australia, and I will be looking very closely at what happens after the 2nd of February 2009. One of the questions that really arises is this funny way that we choose and appoint judges really a very successful way? And by and large, we have to concede it does select pretty impressive judges on the whole. I mean, the system does, it's a bit like the jury. If you were inventing a system, you probably wouldn't invent it, but on the whole, it works. One of the things that I worry about is the idea that judges should be appointed by a so-called judicial commission. Now, that sounds all right, but one of the problems would be that that would tend to mean that judges would be appointing judges. I don't really favour that. I really do think the electoral democracy that we have and the fact that elected people choose the judges is combined with the principle that the judges themselves, at least thereafter, never have anything to do with the party political system, is a way of infusing the courts with the changes of philosophy and values that come over time from the democratic electoral process. I had a bit of an experience recently for the alternative system, which is the South African system, whereby a selection committee, a panel, chooses judges, and then the executive government can select from the judges who are put up those who will be appointed. I applied at a very late stage in my life, namely last year, to be considered for appointment to a new United Nations tribunal, the United Nations Appeals Tribunal. And so I put my hat in the ring, and I was told I was wanted for a job interview in Geneva. And the first time in 40 years I went. It was actually in The Hague eventually, and I went to The Hague and was interviewed by this panel chaired by Justice Kate O'Regan of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And I was told I would have to do my first job test in 40 years. And I thought this will be an aptitude test, which I will do very well in because I'm very aptitudinal. But instead it was a test of a problem with the statute of the United Nations and the rules of the tribunal, and I had to solve the problem and write the opinion of the tribunal in 2 hours. And all these learned judges from all over the world who were selected were all traipsing into this little room. They said, "Your time begins now." And it was like going back to school. It was like doing the leaving certificate again. And I was required to do my test anyway. I did all right in the test, and afterwards the judge from Sri Lanka, who was one of the judges, said, "We were all very impressed by the eloquence of your opinion." And I naturally... Then one of them said, "And its length." But we all only had 2 hours, and I got it all down. And anyway, I'm on a short list, but now the South African system prevails. It'll go to the General Assembly, which will elect the judges. We won't know this for several months, and what happens is in the lap of the gods, or the next best thing, the lap of the United Nations General Assembly. So that is something new and different, but don't ever turn over the appointment of judges solely to judges or members of the legal profession. It's very important that judges who speak for justice for the whole community should have the confidence of the whole community and choice by representatives of the community. When I got there, I found that I worked on level 9, and in level 9 building, I had 2 staff. My PA was in Sydney. The facilities are marvellous. The library is the best and biggest law library in the Southern Hemisphere. There's a wonderful researcher who works in the library who helps you with research on speeches and so on. All in all, you couldn't wish for a better working environment. The work methods of the High Court indicate that talk of the dissent rates and so on can sometimes be misleading, because there's a very big component of the work which is getting through the special leave applications. Some of them heard orally, some of them now, at least half, heard on the papers. And you don't get an oral hearing if you don't get through that step. And on those 2 steps, there's virtually no disagreement. Occasionally there is, but virtually none. And you've got to take that into account in judging the level of disagreement within the court. Once a case is chosen, then of its very character, it's been chosen because it's a case about which reasonable people can have different points of view. And often it's a case on which a judge of an intermediate court has dissented. And so it shouldn't be a matter of surprise that there are disagreements within the High Court on such decisions. Such decisions tend to be at the cutting edge of the law. There is discussion in the High Court before we go into court. Chief Justice French has introduced an additional discussion which takes place on the Monday of the sitting of the court in Canberra. So there's further pre-discussion, and there's always discussion after the hearing, which Chief Justice Gleeson introduced, and that was something we always did in the Court of Appeal in New South Wales. One thing that is different in the Court of Appeal, in my experience, and in the High Court, is this. In the Court of Appeal, as President, it was my job to assign every month, for the sitting of the month ahead, the judge who would have the primary responsibility for writing the first draft in the case, or for giving an ex-temp decision, because the Court of Appeal had to get through its work with about 35% of cases dealt with ex-temp. And it was left to the President to assign, and I always tried to make sure that everybody had a fair go, the boring cases and the interesting cases, the big cases and the small cases, the equity cases and the common law cases. You don't give all the equity cases to those equity people. You give them occasionally to the common law people to make sure that somebody's looking from outside the prison of ideas. And that was the system in the Court of Appeal. I think it's the system in most intermediate courts in Australia. And it's accepted by everyone in order to get through the work. Because the work in the intermediate courts is really hard. My last year in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, I signed 389 opinions, whereas in the High Court you do about 60. So it's really hard stuff, and you've got to keep your ego under control and make sure that you're getting through the work. In the High Court that doesn't exist, and I think that is a weakness in the High Court system. There needs to be a system of assignment and fair assignment between the justices in order to ensure that they all take an equal part in writing for the court. And I think if that were done, that would be an improvement in the system in the court. The staff that you have, well, I was the only one, I'm still the only one who advertised. I advertised because when I came through the leaving certificate in New South Wales, maximum pass, first in the state and history and all this, I couldn't get articles. I went to Fort Street, which is a very good school. 5 of the justices of the High Court went to Fort Street, couldn't get articles. The Old Boy Network worked for those who were children of the Old Boy Network. And so I always advertised, and I got students, applicants from all over the country. I always appointed one male and one female, and I always tried, other things being equal, to choose from outside the sandstones. They get pretty well looked after by the others. And so in the last few years, my associates have been from the University of Western Sydney, the UTS, Murdoch, Flinders, and so on. And getting people from all over the place. So I think that's been a good thing for the court and a good thing certainly for me. But staff who work on the judgments in the Court of Appeal, churning through these cases, we didn't have time to check every little detailed fact, but in the High Court they've got 2 staff members who go through every case. They check the facts against the transcript and against the appeal books. They make sure that we don't make slips and mistakes, and that is a marvellous service, but it just isn't possible in other courts. It's just not feasible with the number of cases. I did love living in Canberra. I have to tell you, most of the judges have the rooms facing the airport, and that is where they look longingly as the place to which they would like to be as quickly as conceivably possible. But in my case, I was looking out at Parliament House, I was looking at the old and the new buildings, and I would walk along the lake. And it's really, you probably have it here, many of you, walking to work. It's a wonderful experience. You think, you exercise, it's what human beings are supposed to do, but that is now behind me. I love visiting the States, and I was the only one, I'm afraid, who was trying to urge that the High Court should come up here. As was said, you have more than your share, I won't say more than your fair share, of cases that are interesting. I mean, your cases are often very interesting from this territory, and of course you have had really brilliant Solicitors General who, in a wily way, would be standing there staring up at you and watching you as every moment looking along the bench and making sure that they are getting the vibes too. I think it would be a good thing if the High Court of Australia came here if there was enough business. It should be the same as it is in Hobart. If there's business, enough business, say 1 or 2 cases, they should come up here, maybe linked to the Perth Circuit. We had to cancel the Perth Circuit this year because there was no business. Now, if there's business in Darwin and no business in Perth, I think the answer is clear. And in my life, I once made a trip to Broome, and Antoine Blumen, the magistrate there, a wonderful magistrate, imaginative, inventive, and he had all the magistrates of that part of Western Australia. Everyone was there that has pride of place in my chambers in Canberra. They are really people at the cutting edge of law and of the delivery of justice in our country. And I honour people who work in Darwin, in Broome, in Alice Springs, in the far reaches of this continent, bringing the rule of law and justice to people in all parts of the country. Now, that is what I've given you. That's as much as you're going to get from me, unless we have some questions about insider's view of the High Court. But I want to put before you now what I think is as dispassionate a view as I can have of the things where I have had a measure of success and the things where, as a Justice of the High Court, I have not had good success. And I'll leave it to you to think of what grade you will give me as a Justice of the High Court. This is where you are the judges of the Judge of the High Court. Now, these are what I think, 10 items where I think I have had some success. Number 1, all my life for 34 years, and all my life for the last 13 years in the High Court, I have been an independent judge in an independent court which has been independent and, according to its view of the case, impartial in determining the case. We are here in this courtroom. We are here in a courtroom of independent justice. Take it from me, from my work in the International Commission of Jurors, my work in the world, this is not normal. This is exceptional. This is precious. It is something we must always cherish. If we are lawyers, we must be proud to be part of it. And so I think I have played a part. I have never had a minister telephoning me to tell me how to decide a case. I've never had somebody at a club, I'm not a member of any club, but if I were digging me in the ribs, I haven't had any politicians politicians, any trade unionists. Occasionally Mr Murdoch says something in a newspaper, but we can read that and ignore it. But that is a wonderful aspect of being a judge in Australia and about our system. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I have been polite to the parties. I have been polite to the lawyers. I have been polite to self-represented litigants. Self-represented litigants really test us. And everybody can be polite to Mr Barker, because if you're not polite to Mr Barker, then you pay a huge price. And similarly to the administrator when he was at the bar table. But to be polite to self-represented litigants is when we are tested. And it's hard, and it's when we were doing special leaves and having hundreds of people who were claiming special leave in refugee cases, trying to explain to them that they had to show jurisdictional error. Jurisdictional error. Now, because I am not entirely sure I understand jurisdictional error, that wasn't always easy, but that is when we are tested most. The Court of Appeal of New South Wales had been a slaughterhouse before I arrived, and all of that, I hope, changed forever. You don't get the best out of lawyers if you're rude to them, because their blood pressure rises, and you've got to always remember, and being a solicitor and a barrister teaches you, behind the representative is somebody who is very nervous this day and who is depending on you to make a good and fair and lawful decision. Number three, I think I helped to project the idea of the intermediate appellate courts. At the time I was appointed in New South Wales, the Court of Appeal of New South Wales was the only permanent intermediate appellate court, and since then there is one in Queensland, in Victoria, in Western Australia, in the ACT, there is an appellate court in this territory, and there's an intermediate court in the family court. And I think that is a better and more efficient way of dealing with appeals. And Justice Priestley served in this territory, and in fact Chief Justice French has suggested, and I think this is a very good idea, that there should be a pooling of commissions, so that judges of different parts of Australia can serve for a time in the appellate system. It does mean you don't get any hint, suggestion or possibility that the appellate judge is going light on a colleague, because that judge may be sitting in an appeal from them in a few weeks' time. And I think it's a better system. But the price of that system is that the High Court has to respect the intermediate appellate courts. There was a great decision in Chief Justice Mason's time called Nguyen and Nguyen, and it said that it is not correct to say that the High Court is the only place that can re-express and develop the common law and the statute law of Australia, because it just doesn't get enough cases and doesn't do it, won't have time to do it. And therefore it's important that the High Court should recognise that the intermediate appellate courts have a role in developing and re-expressing the law, and not to criticise them when they do so, because that is part of the genius of the common law system. Number four, I believe that I have contributed to the institutional law reform. I can remember those days when I was first appointed to the ALRC, how there was real animosity towards institutional law reform. There was real objection. Chief Justice Young, otherwise a great judge, said that the trouble with law reformers is they've got a professional investment in being in favour of reform. But now we always receive law reform reports. They're usually very useful, well-researched material that we use in the work of the judges. Many of the judges of the High Court, Chief Justice French, Justice Hayden, Justice Kiefel, have been commissioners of the ALRC, and Justice Bell was also involved with the ALRC. So I think it's now not an issue, using law reform and seeing the role of law reform in our system of law is something that is accepted. Number 5, I have always been, partly because of my work in law reform, close to the academic community. The academics are very clever people who have more time usually to think through the conceptual problems, that practicing lawyers are just so flat out winning the case that we don't always have the time, and therefore there should be no tension here. The academic community looks at the principles, looks at the policies, and they help the judges. And it's very noticeable that in recent years all of the justices in the High Court and judges of intermediate courts are now referring much more than they ever did when I was starting out to academic writing and conceptual thinking. Number 7, I believe that I have played some useful role in an outreach to the media. The media is the way in which most people get their knowledge about the law, for ill, good and ill. Often it's sort of incorrect knowledge, and we have to admit that the way our discipline is reported in Australia, on the whole, is pretty abysmal. But part of the problem is that judges have not recognised the time limits, the deadlines, the constraints that media work to. And I think, learning from my time in the Law Reform Commission, I have played some little part. Not all judges are like those judges in Rumpole. The judges in Australia, by and large, are earnest, hard-working and democratic people who are doing a very difficult job. And it's important that the community knows that and respects them, because otherwise the judicial branch won't get the proper support. Number 8, purposive interpretation is something I was always on about. This idea of taking the statute and just looking at the words, looking at them in isolation, was the traditional way that I learned when I started out on this journey. But now, increasingly, and part of the tribute here must go to Justice McHugh for saying this in Keprose and Kingston in New South Wales. The idea of doing that is now rejected. We have to look at the words, we have to look at them in their context, we've got to look at them in the context of the statutory history and why the Act has been enacted, and I think that is now pretty uncontroversial, and I played a part in that in the Court of Appeal and in the High Court. Number 9, I've always tried to be user-friendly in communication. Communication in the law shouldn't be too difficult. I mean, if you read that marvellous decision of the High Court in the Communist Party case, it's a wonderful decision, but truly, page after page, without even a paragraph break, it is cruel. It is a cruel and unusual punishment to read those passages. And so I have introduced from the beginning the statement of the facts that is user-friendly, or I've tried to make it so, the headings, the subheadings, and the sub-subheadings. And that is useful, because if you're flat out in a case and you're on your feet and something blows up, and what is the authority for that? Then you can go straight in and you can look over, and those dense paragraphs, they'll get ignored. It's the paragraphs with the sub-subheading, and which will help the advocate to win the case. And the final point, number 10, and I hope you'll let me say this, I think on the issue of sexuality, I have done something useful to our country and to the world, to the world of the law and to our profession. One of the most moving things in recent weeks is the numbers of letters I've received from people, some of them gay people, but many of them parents of gay people, and most of them from straight people, saying that they appreciated this step and it's made them think through things. Now, don't think that Johan and I don't realise that it's a little bit awkward and a bit unusual and a bit of a challenge to what you think to see us around. Well, you're going to see us around today and tonight. And in a way, you are doing us the honour of adjusting your minds to these things. And once we wouldn't have talked about this up here in the Territory or anywhere, but I think it has been a good step. It's been a good step for everyone. And anything that is rational and real and scientific is a good thing for us all to accommodate to and get over it. If we have a problem, you just have a big glass of water and to take a Beck sip and you'll feel better in the morning. Now, I'm now going as candidly as I can to say the things where it wasn't all successful. Number one, I was not a barrister for long enough. I was plucked from the bar. I was a solicitor for 6.5 years, and then I was a barrister for 7 years, and then I was appointed to the Arbitration Commission. People said to me, well, you must have known you were going to the Law Reform Commission onto the High Court. Well, I didn't know that at all. I thought the Arbitration Commission in those days was a great national tribunal. People of my age realised with the High Court it was the only big federal show in town. And it was a very important tribunal, and I had a big practice in that area, including in the appellate work in that area, but I never had the practice as a barrister, which is a very important and very useful practice to be a really good judge. I was never a QC. My brother David was a QC. He's now a judge of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. He does wall-to-wall murder. He has a really hard job, I often think to myself, could you do that job? That is really hard stuff. And of course I suppose I could do it, but I really admire and I honour the people who fight murder cases or big criminal cases and who sit in judgment in those things. So that is something where my life was a bit unusual and I didn't have that experience. Number two, I was never a trial judge in those cases. I was an appellate judge. And that gave me a particular outlook, which was useful and good, but maybe I would have been a better appellate judge if I'd had some time as a trial judge. I did some trial work in the Arbitration Commission and in the Federal Court, but not much, because I'd been pushed off to the Law Reform Commission, and that is a weakness in my career, and I recognise it. And I'm being candid to you tonight. That was something where it wasn't all that successful. Number three, I was really good as a presiding judge in appellate work. And when I was appointed to the High Court, I was banished to the far side. And only in my dying days have I been elevated further up into somewhere close to the central seat. Justice Breyer in the Supreme Court of the United States told me he had a similar experience. He was a judge, a chief judge of a federal circuit, and then he was appointed to the Supreme Court. He said, half your personality goes out the window when you are removed from that central seat. And I was really good at that. I'm a very good chairman. I have to say so myself. I was a very good chairman of international committees. They keep asking me back. And that is something which I haven't really been able to maximise in the judicial branch, because in the High Court I was on the sidelines, and even then I asked too many questions, because I have been used to asking a lot of questions. When you're in the middle, you ask the questions, and that was something I was good at and did. Number four, dissent rates. Well, they shouldn't be exaggerated for the reasons that I've told you. You have to put them in the context of all the other things. And frankly, I think there probably should be more dissents in other cases. Why aren't there more disagreements in cases which of their nature have been chosen to be here at special leave? Maybe I should have tried harder to get consent. I used to buy myself a big finger bun on the weekend and go in and say, Michael, read these cases and try to agree. Try to agree. And then I would read if there was a decision in, and unfortunately I either couldn't agree with the reasoning or with the outcome. Now, what does a judge do then? Do you just agree because then life is easier and it is more congenial, everybody likes you a bit more, or do you give your honest opinion? I mean, I do think, Justice McHugh used to say to me in the Court of Appeal, where my dissent rate was only about 12%, he used to say, the President mustn't dissent so much. 12%? Now it's more like 30%. But that's 70% agreement. So maybe I should have been better at building consensus. They say Justice William Brennan in the Supreme Court of the United States was a great man for building consensus within the court. I would challenge Justice Brennan, if he were still around, to build a consensus of his liberal views of the Constitution of the United States with Justice Scalia, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas. The philosophical differences are important. They are legitimate. They are legitimate in our court. I never question the integrity and honesty of those who have a different view. But I do think somehow maybe I could have done better in that respect. I don't know. Number 5, international human rights. Well, I go on about this, but I think it's just every time you look at the internet, every time you get on a jumbo jet, every time you go to a foreign place, every time you speak to judges overseas, you realise we now have to think in a bigger dimension. But I haven't really been too successful in persuading others to that point of view. There has been the decision in Roach, the case of prisoners' voting rights. And in that case, the majority, Chief Justice Gleeson, Justice Camo, Justice Crennan and I, did look at international human rights. But on the whole, that hasn't really yet been accepted. Number 6, I believe I haven't been entirely successful in policy, the consideration of policy in the cases. And in fact, the administrator showed me a very interesting book which he had been sent by Rachel Gray on the methodology of the High Court, rather suggesting that the High Court has returned to the legalism of the Nixon-Truman period, though perhaps even more so. And so that is something where that view, which I think is important, hasn't really been accepted. Number 7, I have to admit, like all judges, that I have made mistakes in court. I have made mistakes. I sat in the first special leave application in Mallard. You know Mallard, Mr. Mallard in Perth, Mr. Mallard who was convicted by the jury and was convicted on the basis largely of his own statement, but also other evidence. But subsequently, because of pro bono lawyering, it was demonstrated beyond doubt that not only was he wrongly convicted, but he was almost certainly innocent. And Justice Dunford at an inquiry in Perth has found he was innocent. He applied for special leave at the first hearing after his conviction, and I sat with Justice McHugh and Justice Turi and Justice McHugh in refusing him special leave. And therefore I've asked myself, could I have prevented that? Their argument on that special leave was quite different. It was that the judge had excluded polygraph evidence. And we all know that that is very rarely accepted in our courts. So I don't feel too guilty, but I then asked myself, well, if you had spent a bit more time reading that book, would you have seen that it didn't fit together, that it couldn't have been at this part of Perth at a time when he was in the watch house, and at another part of Perth at a time when he was seen in a television or a camera on a taxi doing a run-up? That was essentially the way in which it was demonstrated that it just didn't fit together. But that is something that worries a judge. It should worry all of us. And so I've made mistakes, and for those to whom I've made mistakes, I apologise, I regret it. I've also made occasional mistakes in out-of-court statements. One of the prices you pay if you try to communicate is that you sometimes say things that are inappropriate. For example, I was given an honorary degree at the University of South Australia, and they couldn't fit me in the law graduation, so I was shoved in with an education graduation. They were all teachers. So I honoured my teachers. And people were going on at the time attacking public school teachers. Well, my entire education was public school. For a long time I've been the only justice on the High Court who's public school educated, beginning to end. and I had wonderful teachers. So I said a few things that maybe I shouldn't have said about public education and the funding of private education as against public education. But I felt that was appropriate to the occasion of an education graduation. And anyway, I couldn't think of anything else to say to all the teachers. There was an occasion also where I referred to the work choices legislation at one stage and industrial ayatollahs. That was not a good choice of language, and you know, that was a mistake. So for all of those mistakes, I beg indulgence. I was trying to communicate, and when you do so, sometimes you say the wrong thing, but that shouldn't happen. Judges especially, it shouldn't happen. Number 9, I didn't always get the work-life balance right. I mean, they say that when you're on your deathbed, you're not going to say, oh, I wish I could go out and write another article for the Sydney Law Review. But we've had wonderful exhibitions in Canberra, of Monet and Degas, and I didn't go and see them because I was just too busy working on the law. There is another life outside the law. It's not the only thing in the world, and probably not the only thing that enriches the spirit, which is a long time dead. So I'm hoping that that will all change. And the 10th thing, which was not at all nice, was the attack in Parliament, which was a breach of the relationships between the Parliament and the judiciary. And I do think, I may be unfair, but I think that was in part engendered as a reaction to Johan and my decision to be out and honest and open about our sexuality. That upset some people. We understand that that upsets some people, but we've all sort of got to get over that and get used to it. And so it was just something that I think I had to live through, but it wasn't nice, and it was a failure in the sense of the institutions of Australia at the time. So that is the scorecard. Quite a few good things. Michael needs to be more analytical in thought, said one of my teachers. Well, I think I took that one seriously. And he certainly has tried. He's been very trying, and he's done his best, but there have been quite a few things where it hasn't really been all that good, and you've got to put that into the balance. And you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have to decide whether or not, on the whole, I deserve mercy or whether I deserve the chop. But under the Constitution, I get the chop on the 2nd of February 2009, and I say at the end, as I said at the beginning, it's been a wonderful privilege to come here, to be with you. I like it up here. I have since my law reform days. I always love coming here. I feel comfortable and welcomed here. But it's also been a great privilege to be a judge in the independent judicature of the Commonwealth of Australia. And all of us who work with or associated with it, we know its faults. Everyone who is a lawyer in this room knows its weaknesses and its faults, its inaccessibility, its cost, its sometimes impatience, the stresses and pressures. But as the systems of justice of the world go, it's pretty good, and it's our job to continue that and to make it better. We can't let you go today without giving you just something that will, we hope, enable you to remember us today. Duncan, would you be able to come up
we've tried to find something that's, number one, portable, and number two, that says territory. Thank you very much.
It's no longer alive.
Entertainment and refreshments.
There's, well...